Have you ever stopped to wonder what really makes a natural disaster deadly? We tend to think it's all about raw power, right? The sheer force of nature. But as we're about to see, the real story, it's a lot more complicated and honestly, a lot more human. So let's get right into it.
I mean, that question just seems to defy logic, doesn't it? How can a quake that's literally hundreds of times less powerful cause so much more death and destruction? It feels wrong. Well, this is the puzzle we're going to unpack today, and the answer reveals a tectonic divide that's not just in the Earth's crust, but in our world itself.
And here it is. This is the core idea of this whole explainer. A hazard, an earthquake, a volcano, a tsunami, it only really becomes a disaster when it slams into a vulnerable population. The real story isn't about magnitude. It's about money, it's about infrastructure, and it's about preparation. It all boils down to one word: resilience. Now, to really see this idea in action, there is no better example than a tale of two earthquakes. They happened within about a year of each other, one in Haiti and one in Japan. And the outcomes? Well, they couldn't have been more tragically different.
Okay, so on paper, the numbers look pretty clear. You've got Haiti's magnitude 7.0 quake on one side and Japan's massive 9.0 on the other. Now, you gotta remember, the magnitude scale is logarithmic, which is a fancy way of saying that 9.0 quake in Japan released hundreds, literally hundreds of times more energy. But, and this is the whole point, the shock to humanity was completely tragically reversed.
In Haiti, the death toll was just staggering. It's hard to even wrap your head around it. Over 200,000 people lost their lives. This wasn't just a disaster. It was a full-blown societal catastrophe, and the nation is still, to this day, struggling to recover. And then you have Japan. Now, the loss of around 18,000 lives was, of course, a terrible tragedy. But the big story, the one that dominated the headlines, was the colossal economic damage, more than $200 billion. And this shows a really key pattern. Developed nations tend to suffer these huge financial blows, while developing nations suffer the immense human ones.
So what gives? Why the insane difference? Well, it all comes down to this. Japan had decades of investment in resilience on its side. We're talking strict building codes that make buildings sway instead of pancake, advanced warning systems that pinged people's phones, and a population that knew exactly what to do. In Haiti, it was the opposite story. It was a story of vulnerability. Poorly made buildings that just collapsed, a super densely packed city, and a government that simply didn't have the resources to respond quickly.
But listen, this isn't just a simple black and white story of rich versus poor. It's more nuanced than that. To really get it, we've got to look at Chile, a country that sits in this really fascinating middle ground. This quote from our source material just nails it. Countries like Chile, they're in transition, right? They've got some of the protections of a developed nation, but they're still facing some of the big vulnerabilities of a developing one. And this chart just lays it out perfectly. Look at Chile in 2010. They were hit with an 8.8 magnitude quake. That is a monster, way more powerful than Haiti's and almost as strong as Japan's. But the death toll? Around 500. Still awful, of course, but just a tiny fraction of what happened in Haiti. That is what meeting resilience looks like in the real world. Better building codes and more preparation made a world of difference. And hey, this whole principle doesn't just apply when the ground is shaking. The very same patterns of development and vulnerability play out with other huge tectonic hazards, like volcanoes and tsunamis. Just take a look at these two volcanic eruptions. You probably remember the one in Iceland in 2010, the one with the name nobody could pronounce. That caused a massive economic mess by shutting down air travel all over Europe. But the direct human cost was very, very low. Now, flip the script to Colombia in 1985. The eruption of Nevado del Ruiz. That was a story of devastating, localized human cost. The tragedy in the town of Armero was like a horrifying chain of dominoes. See, the eruption itself wasn't the direct killer. What it did was melt a glacier on the summit, which then triggered these enormous, fast-moving mud flows called lahars. The town of Armero was right in their path, and because the warnings were delayed and people weren't prepared, over 23,000 people died when that town was just buried in mud. And, maybe no single event shows this vulnerability more starkly than the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. This chart, the numbers just speak for themselves. The catastrophic death toll was almost entirely borne by developing and emerging nations like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Thailand. And here's the absolute kicker. At the time, the Pacific Ocean had a really solid tsunami warning system. The Indian Ocean? It didn't. That single piece of missing infrastructure, a direct result of less regional investment, was a huge reason why more than 230,000 people lost their lives. It's just devastating. So after all that, what's the big lesson here? What do we take away from this? Well, it brings us to a really urgent point. We have to understand, and we have to address, this global resilience gap. You can actually boil this all down to a simple but really powerful equation. You take a physical hazard, the earthquake, the volcano, and you add human vulnerability. The sum of those two things gives you the true impact. Nature deals the cards, sure, but we decide how to play them through our choices in development and preparedness. And so, that right there, that is the tectonic divide in a nutshell. For developed nations, the pain is most often measured in dollars and cents, rebuilding roads, dealing with supply chains. But for developing nations, the pain is measured in lives lost, in families displaced, and in a recovery that can take generations. So this leaves us with a really big question. The tectonic plates of our planet connect all of us. A disaster in one corner of the world can create ripple effects everywhere. So in this deeply interconnected world, what's our responsibility to each other? How do we work together to bridge this deadly resilience gap? It's definitely something worth thinking about.